1 Corinthians chapter 9, as we come to the end of this series in the journey. You cannot escape in the Bible without seeing that those who are on the journey of glory with Jesus, those who are following Christ to glory, are called to do something. Now, that calling is not based upon our efforts or our abilities. It's based upon the glory of God overwhelming our lives. And so this morning, what I want to talk about and what we want to look at is the fact that we are on this journey, that God is asking us while on this journey of glory to bring somebody along with us. That we ought to invite people to come along in the journey. We ought to share the journey with other people. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. In fact, it's all the way through the Bible that he doesn't just want us to walk this alone. He wants us to invite others on the journey to glory. Let's just consider for a moment Jesus' last words. And by the way, we're going to get to 1 Corinthians 9. A little funny clip here for a moment. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 was the message that I preached when I came to FCF to try out in view of a call. It hit me as I was preparing the series, and I was thinking about coming back to this passage, just because I said I'm going to kind of end with some passages that have meant a lot to me and have really grown my faith, and as I talk about really my own journey, and this is one of them that I preach actually in my tryout sermon before I was voted on here at FCF. It's funny, I went back and listened to that sermon, and I couldn't help but to laugh all the way through it. I have no clue why this church even hired me. Now, my view of that message doesn't change because I try to lift high the Word of God. But I have to be honest, it was a bit humorous. I was like, man, I really didn't know what I was doing. So I'm hoping to be a little bit better. And what's going to happen is 10 years from now, I'm going to listen back to this sermon. I'm going to be like, I can't believe those people put up with me for 8 years. And hopefully I'm going to continue to grow in my ability of preaching and teaching. But nonetheless, this chapter has meant a great deal to me, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But before we do, I want us to see what Jesus said, because Paul is going to echo the words of Jesus here, I believe. And Jesus in Matthew 28 ends his ministry on earth before he ascends into heaven. After he resurrects, he says these words. And all of us probably know these words. We've heard them before. Matthew 28 verse 16. It says this. It says, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee. So here's Matthew 28, 16. To the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Now, I want us to see that for a moment. Even here, when Jesus was about ready to ascend into heaven, after he resurrected from the dead, there are still some that doubted. But many worshiped. And I believe what he's about to say only is grasped by those who worship him. So, this is not something we just are commanded to do. This is based upon the fact that we worship him, and then he enables us to do these things. So he says this, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. He ends with the promise, I'm with you in this journey. Now, if we look at those verses, Matthew 28, 16 through 20, and we were to ask the question, what is the main point? What is Jesus asking us to do? What is the main verb, if I can call it that, of this text? There's one verb here. What is the verb? Now, probably most of us, if we read this, as many of us have probably heard before, it's going, right? Go. That's actually not a verb here. The main verb, now some of you are like, Dave, are you serious? You're going to give us an English lesson on Sunday morning? Don't you realize we're off school on Sunday? In fact, this is a bit of a Greek lesson. Our English just doesn't do well at giving us what the information is because it looks like we have multiple verbs here. These aren't verbs. There's one verb in this text. You know what the verb is here? The verb is make disciples. Make followers. Bring along someone else. And how do we do that? He surrounds that verb with participles. Now, you might say, what is a participle? A participle is there to help the verb. It's giving us a description of how we accomplish the verb. And so here, the participles are going, teaching, baptizing, observing, right? We have these participles that come alongside the main verb, which is to make disciples, bring followers along. But I want to focus on that first participle. It's interesting, that word go. That's not the main verb. It's only there to tell us to make disciples, but it says to go. The Greek word here is the word paruthentis, or It's from the word peruomai. And what it literally means is to travel, to depart, to take a journey, to go on a walk. The word peruomai. But here in this text, the way it's used, it literally means having gone or as you're going. In other words, the image that Jesus is giving them is make disciples as you're going along in life. You're walking this life, you're going along, you already have walked. Make disciples along the way. Bring people along with you on the journey as we're going. So this tells us a couple things. First of all, you cannot stay where you are and make disciples. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about you have to move away from your house. I'm talking about the fact that you can't just stay spiritually where you're at and just sit in there and wait for your ticket to heaven to come up and that be it. It is the idea that we are, as we're going, we're bringing people along. Jesus asks us to do this, commands us to do this in the way of making disciples as we're going. And this isn't meant to be an impossible burden. It's meant to be a normal overflow of our lives. If we grasp what Jesus has done, we are going to want to make disciples, and we're going to do it as we're going, as we're walking about, as we're going along. I remember when Allison first told me that she was pregnant with our oldest son, David. It's hard to believe next year he's going to be getting his license as we move. Or permit. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Permit first. And that scares me to death. And so we were just, we were talking a little bit about how he was. And here he is, a strapping young man who thinks he can beat dad. And I remember when he was that baby who had this hair that went everywhere. We got pictures, his hair just, he would wake up as like a Chia pet, just like everywhere. But I remember vividly when Allison came to me and she said, Dave, I'm expecting. Now, if I'm being honest with you, my first reaction was not, yeah! I didn't even figure out how that all worked yet. Just kidding. It took me a few times, but she came to me, and my first thought, now mind you, I was 21 years old. We had gotten married pretty young. And she came to me, and I was like, what? How did this happen? I mean, I was overwhelmed with this idea of how was I going to change a diaper? I don't even know how to change diapers. And then I thought, I can't even afford diapers. In fact, my son was born in April. I went to my college graduation in May. I don't even know how we survived those moments. But I remember as for Allison, she was so excited. She was like, I'm going to send announcements to everybody I know. I'm going to tell them that we're expecting. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to figure out how we're going to live, how we're going to survive. And somehow, now eventually we got to the fourth one. And when you have four, you know why you have four, because she couldn't keep her hands off me. And so we get to the fourth one. I'm just being honest with you. We get to the fourth, and by the fourth one, Isaac, she says she's expecting. I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. I'm just so excited, and you can't help but to want to tell everybody, I'm going to be a father again. I'm going to be a dad again. I'm so excited. Now, if you're here and you've had children, you know that feeling, right? I want you to consider this for a moment. It reminds me, by the way, of the Mercedes-Benz commercial. You've seen that? Where it says, some things in life are too important not to share. And I don't know who's sharing their Mercedes-Benz, but if you have one and you want to share it, I'll gladly use it. But I love that line. Some things in life are too important to share. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Jesus Christ walked out of a grave. And yet, statistics and studies say that only 2% of evangelical Christians ever share their faith. You mean Jesus walked out of a grave after being brutally beaten, clearly unable to even walk if it was you and I, taking sin for the first time upon himself on the cross, and then walks out of the grave on his own accord? And yet 2% of us actually ever share our faith throughout our Christian lives. There's a problem in American Christianity. Christ rose from the dead, and yet so few of us actually share that. probably most of us here would say, I want to share that. Probably most of us would raise their hand saying, yes, I want to tell people about Jesus. In fact, I would dare say to you, can I just for a moment take a commercial break? We are wired to reproduce, not only physically, but spiritually. We're wired in us with the Holy Spirit to want to tell somebody this truth. We are wired that way. In fact, if you want to know how do you spiritually grow, one of the ways you spiritually grow, the Bible tells us, is by sharing it. In fact, Paul writes to Philemon these words. Listen to these. It says, I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective for the full knowledge of every good thing that is in us for the sake of Christ. You see what Paul says to Philemon? He says that as you share your faith, you get fuller knowledge of what Christ has done for you. In other words, God uniquely wired sharing your faith with growing your faith. So if you're going to grow in the walk in the journey of glory, then you're going to have to share it. You and I are going to have to share it, and yet so few of us share it. So here's the question. Do you think there's any wonder why there's so many problems in the world? Do you think there's any wonder why there's so many weak, immature Christians in the world? Is it possibly because we don't share what we believe to be true? We never proclaim that Jesus is alive, that he's risen, that he can be trusted, that he can change your life? Now I know, let me just for a moment say this. I realize that for most of us, we look at the world that we live in and we see this changing landscape of American Christianity. Let's be honest. There is a changing landscape that you and I see every day in the world that we live. We live in what is called a postmodern, post-Christian, biblically illiterate, spiritually hungry world. It's desperate. I mean, turn on the news and what do you see? You see Christianity openly mocked. You see the idea, the nightly news will tell you there's problems in the world, and yet when anybody mentions God, they don't like it. Watch any movie, watch the news, read print, you're going to find a bit of mockery toward the things of Christ. Even, by the way, moral living. You can look this up. Even morality itself, which comes from the Bible, ultimately from God himself, we see even morality vilified and attacked by media. So it would seem from a human perspective that Christianity is losing out. And our instinct when we see Christianity losing out is to begin to isolate, is to begin to withdraw, is to begin to try to pad our lives so that we don't become like them. Here's the problem. There are two responses that we can have in the changing landscape of America, of Christianity. First of all, we can embrace the fact that this may be the greatest opportunity in the history of the world to share the gospel. We can embrace that this is exactly the moment where the church became more relevant ever in history, is when people are against it. When people are against Jesus is when the church has flourished the most. This could be the moment where we embrace the opportunity more than any other, or we could curse the change. And I believe for many of us as Christians, that's what we do. We tend to just curse the fact that it's changing. So you go onto anybody's Facebook page, especially as Christians, and all you see is complaining about the way the culture is going. Maybe the answer isn't to complain about the culture. The answer is to give the answer, which is Jesus. To say, has God given us an amazing opportunity to be the one to stand out against what the culture is saying is true? Because guess what? That's what they're looking for, is the answer. They're looking for the answer, Jesus. What Paul says, as we're going to read here in 1 Corinthians, we're going to spend some time in 1 Corinthians. What Paul says is the problem. The problem in humanity is that we are preoccupied with our own personal rights. Here we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Let me give you what Paul's saying and give you a little context here. In 1 Corinthians 8 through 1 Corinthians 10, Paul begins a discussion. This is a kind of a unique section. Paul begins a discussion on rights. And Paul says the problem with the gospel, the problem with the church is everybody's about their own rights. Well, this is my right and that's your right, and you don't have right to tell me how to live, and you can't force your rights upon me. And that's the problem. We think, well, that's their right and this is my right, and I'm just going to live the way I want to live, and if it doesn't impact other people, it doesn't matter. It's my right to do this, and it's their right to believe what they want. No. Paul says this. In 1 Corinthians 8, he says, listen, you got to lay aside your personal rights. And if you read 1 Corinthians 8, he says this over and over again, lay aside the personal rights so that your brother doesn't stumble. So he talks about the church, and he says you got to lay aside personal rights so that other people don't stumble in the faith. You come to chapter 9, we're going to look at this. He says you lay aside personal rights so the gospel can go forth. And then you come to chapter 10, and he says, I got to lay aside my personal rights so that I may grow in my faith. And this is the section that stands out in 1 Corinthians. Now, if you study 1 Corinthians, it's a messed up church. And he is writing, and one of the main issues is personal rights. You have a right to it. I have a right to it. You can't tell me what my right is. And Paul says, listen, we got to lay aside personal rights. And he ends chapter 10 with this verse. Here's his summary statement of these 3 chapters. He says in chapter 10, verse 32, give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, not seeking my right, but that of many, that they may be saved. Paul says, listen, I'm setting aside my rights so that people will be drawn to the gospel. People will be drawn to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ so that they might be saved. Now, right in the middle of chapter 9, he brings an illustration to show us what he's talking about. Let's take a look. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. He asks the question, and this is actually an illustration he's going to give to that point he comes back to in chapter 10. Verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Now, it is said that illustrations are like windows to a house. Illustrations are there to give us insight into how this is lived. And he brings up this illustration of, don't you know that we're all running in a race? Run that you may obtain the prize. Paul uses multiple illustrations throughout his writings. First of all, illustrations of farmers, illustrations of soldiers, and then he uses illustrations of athletes, athletics. And here's an athletic illustration. Now the question is, why did he use this and what did it mean? Well, this was unique to Corinth. And let me explain a little bit of the background. Corinth would have heard this question. The people of Corinth, they would have been like, yeah, we get that. That's a rhetorical question. Of course you don't run in a race not to win. You don't run in a race just to get a t-shirt. Unless you're running a 5K. I know people that go to 5Ks, they sign up, and they take their t-shirt and leave. I mean, if you're not going to win, why run? I mean, go get a Big Mac and watch the race and get your free t-shirt and say, Thanksgiving trot race. A lot of people do that. Paul says, no. The obvious answer here, if you're in a race, you're going to run to win. You're going to run to win. And the Corinthians understood that. Let me tell you why. Because in Corinth, not only was it a hub, it was actually situated on a peninsula of the Roman Empire there on the Mediterranean Sea. It stands out. It was a trade route. So people would come through that city all the time. It was one of the larger cities of the Roman Empire. It was kind of like the cosmopolitan Vanity Fair city of their day. It was New York City of that day. And people would come through there all the time to buy and sell. It was also one of only 4 places throughout the Roman Empire where they would have races. In fact, the race that initiated there was something called the Games, were called the Isthmian Games. And the Isthmian Games were dedicated to the Greek god Poseidon, or Porcidion, depending on how you pronounce it, who is the god of the sea. Now, of course, it's a false god. It was a Greco-Roman god, and they would dedicate this race called the Isthmian Games to this false god. Now, the Isthmian Games, they were a precursor to our Olympics, so we all kind of get this. But here's how serious the Corinthians took this race. It was written about the Corinthians this. It said the masses demanded 2 things in the city by the political hierarchy. Listen to this is historians. The masses demanded 2 things, bread and game. Some things never change, do they? I mean, what do we do this week? Give me turkey and give me football, right? Give me food and give me game. That was Corinthians. That was their motto. Give us bread and give us game. That's what they expected of the government. Give us bread, give us games. In fact, one author said this about the Corinthians. It says, they believe that every person should have a noble soul and a beautiful body. Sound familiar? Noble soul, yet a beautiful life. They took it this seriously. This is historically true. that they would take every child at the age of 7. And you want to talk about PE class? They took a child at the age of 7 and they began to train them in gymnastics and in exercising. And they would train them in sport like gymnastics, wrestling, boxing, spear throwing, swimming, and running. They would actually take 7-year-olds, they would drop them in frozen lakes and ponds and rivers and seas, and they would tell them to learn to swim. The reason is multiple reasons. First of all, they did that because they believed that would make them later in life a stronger soldier to defend Rome. They were actually raising an army by doing this. Secondly, they also did this to the girls. Now, don't leave here and say this is going to be a sexist statement. This is what they believed. They actually trained women, young ladies, 7 years old and up, in 3 things: wrestling, spear throwing, and swimming. The reason for that is because they believed that if the young lady grew up and she was strong, she would then bear strong men. So they believed that there was good stock in having women learn to wrestle. Now, don't take offense to that. I don't want to meet any of you in the lobby, you ladies, and say, I'm going to beat you up for saying that, Dave. I know in a dark alley there are some of you I would not want to face. That was what they believed. I'm not telling you I agree with it. I'm just telling you they taught the young ladies how to wrestle. Can you imagine? You're driving up in your chariot, your Ford chariot. All right, that'd be broken down along the side of the road. But you're driving up in your chariot, and you pick up your daughter, and they say, where are you going this evening? Well, she's going to wrestling practice. Oh, you're training her to have a strong young man one day who will fight the battles for us for the Roman Empire. That's what they believed. That's what they taught. And so when the Isthmian Games came, the only people allowed to enter would be the people that had been trained, and they would run for a little teeny wreath. Have you ever seen a trophy that has a little wreath on the top? That came from Corinth. It was a bush that was specifically unique in Corinth that was spread throughout the Olympic Games later on. And obviously it was grown up in other places, but it was there in the Isthmian Games where that little wreath began. And Paul's going to bring this up throughout this text. So that's the background. Everybody understands when you're running in a race, the Corinthians would have said to this question, when you run in a race, run that you may obtain a prize. And they would have gone like, yeah, I'm not going to run to finish second. Second place is first loser. Right? They would have said that. They believe that. That's why they train so well. The problem Paul gives us here is not that we don't run in the race. The problem is some of us aren't running to obtain the prize. So he gives us a couple of thoughts here. We're going to look at a few different points. First of all, there is a price, a cost to running in the race. There's a cost to it. Let's go back in the context here. Go back to verse 15. He sets for us that there is a cost to running the race. Verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground of boasting. Let's stop right here for a moment. What he is saying here is this. He's saying, listen, as an apostle, as a teacher of the gospel, there is a right that I have to take and receive money from the church. If you read before this, it describes this. And Paul says, listen, I don't count any of my rights as worth anything. I realize there is a cost to running this race. I realize there is a cost to proclaiming the gospel, and I'm willing to set it aside. There's a personal cost, and I'm willing to set it aside. He goes on. He says, I don't use any of my rights for myself. Verse 16, for if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. By the way, the word woe there is a word, I know sometimes I hear my mother-in-law say this. She'll go, oy vey. You ever heard that? That's a Hebrew word, actually, oy vey. And it's transliterated here in the Greek. It literally means judgment on me. Oy vey, judgment upon me. He says, judgment on me if I don't preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He says there's a cost, and I'm willing to set aside whatever cost it is to present the gospel, to share the gospel. I've been reading this book by Hudson Taylor. It's an autobiography about his life, and it's kind of been eye-opening to me to read a little bit of the history of Hudson Taylor. And it's kind of this section that talks about the story of how he went to China. If you know Hudson Taylor, he's kind of the founder of the modern mission movement. He went to China and founded a mission organization called China Inland Missions. Hudson Taylor spent 51 years in China. He trained over 800 missionaries. He started 125 schools, and there were literally 18,000 Chinese people that came to Jesus as a result of his ministry. By him specifically, not even by the other missionaries he led. But the story is told about Hudson Taylor when he first got to China. They would all live, all these missionaries, many of them 20 and 30 years old, and they were living on the coast of China, and they would go into the mainland, and they would come out. And he found over and over again what happened is many of those young missionaries gave up going into the mainland and stayed on the coast where the cities were, because every time they would go inside the mainland of China, they would be beaten, they would be kicked out, and the name in Chinese was they were called foreign devils. That's what they were called. So he said he went into the mainland of China, he went into the main section in the heart of China, and he would go in these villages, and they would kick him out, they would stone him, they would beat him, they would throw him out, they would almost leave him for dead, they would mob him. And he said he'd come back to the city, and there would be all these missionaries sitting around, and they all looked European or North American, and none of them would go into the jungle. And what he realized is this. He realized the problem was they were going in like North Americans or Europeans. So what he did is he was the only one that did this. For some reason, they were all there, and they didn't think about this. He shaved his head, and he began to wear Oriental Chinese garments that would be worn in the villages. And he went in, and they began to accept him because he set aside his personal rights. He realized that there was a cost to winning those people to Christ. A simple act, yet a significant act, an act that even today even has a reach. What he did in that moment by deciding to set aside his right is still going on today in China. It's still happening today. All because he was willing to get rid of his own identity and his own right for the sake of the gospel. Folks, the same gospel that motivated Hudson Taylor in that way is in us, if you know Jesus. It's the same gospel. How motivated are we to get rid of our rights? Now, the question we have is, how do we do that? How do we set aside our rights? What does it look like to curtail liberties in order to achieve grand objectives? Well, the answer is given in verse 24 and following. Take a look at it. Do you not know, and we're going to make an analogy to sports. My second son, Caleb, is playing high school basketball, and it is a bit bittersweet because it's a lot of work. I mean, they sometimes have 6 a.m. practices. You got to get up and go to school, 6:30 practices before school, and then they practice from 5 to 7 to 9. They have games, and he's like, I don't know why I even signed up for this at some points. It's a lot. Well, the reason is they're building in them something to make them better basketball players, right? So this idea works the same way. The analogy of sports works as Paul uses it. Take a look at verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain. Verse 25. Every athlete exercises self-control. The first thing we see here is that there's motivation. It's a very interesting word, the word athlete. The word athlete is the same word that we saw last week if you were here in Hebrews chapter 12. It's the word agonizomai. It's the word agony. And literally what is happening, the word athlete literally means the one striving, the one running, the one agonizing. So it's not just a simple athlete, it's the one who's going after the prize. There is a motivation that they get for this prize. So any athlete who's running a race has to be motivated to finish the race, has to be motivated to go after it. It's not just for a t-shirt, it's to run for the prize. There is a motivation. The word athlete means I'm motivated to strive toward it. Secondly, notice that they have self-discipline. The word here is self-control. This is the same word that we see in Galatians chapter 5 when talking about the fruit of the Spirit. You and I are given by the Holy Spirit the ability to have self-control, that we're able to control what our bodies do. Now, when we say that, obviously we're talking spiritually here, that we ought to have self-control. For an athlete, they change their diet. They count their sleep. They follow training schedules. They forego social activities. I mean, think about any Olympic athlete. They're actually setting aside personal right and showing and demonstrating self-control. How do we do that spiritually? Do we have the self-control to pray and to study the Scripture, prepare our own hearts to be ready to run for the prize? Are we showing and demonstrating self-control? Thirdly, we see here, and Paul brings this back to himself. He begins to make this personal. Notice what he says. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. Notice he says I. He's personalizing it. I do not run aimlessly. I'm not just a wanderer. I'm not just a straggler. I'm running full on to win. He says, I do not box as one beating the air. By the way, in their day, the Isthmian Games had a well-known fight. It was a combined boxing and wrestling together. Remember, we use today in high school is Greco-Roman wrestling. Some of you are wrestlers in high school. You know what I'm talking about. It's the Greco-Roman style wrestling. I came from that period. But they mix boxing with wrestling. And Corinth was one of the places they had this match. It was kind of a precursor to MMA or UFC, if I'm being honest, because it was fought to surrender. And you know what happens when you get two guys in the ring and say, hey, we're going to fight till surrender? What happens? It's blood everywhere. I mean, because guys are competitive, right? They're in there, they're duking it out. No one wants to give up. But it was until somebody raised their hand and gave up, the battle would go on. And that's the way it was in the Isthmian Games. This is well-documented things. And so they would fight almost to the death at times. Paul says here, you know how crazy it would be to get into the ring to fight and fight beating the air? I mean, could you imagine Muhammad Ali back in the day? Some of you remember back then? Him get in the ring and go, I'm going to fly like a butterfly and sing like a bee, and there'd be nobody there. Let's go, you know? How silly would that be? We would be like, what are you doing? We would make fun of them. Paul says here, I'm not just beating the air. I'm not just boxing, shadow boxing. He says, no. Instead, I am exercising. Verse 27, but I discipline my body. And that's our third word here, exercise. We are preparing us. We are in it. We are making our body ready. And here specifically, spiritually speaking, he's using an analogy to our spiritual life. But I discipline my body and keep it under control. The word he uses is the word hupapiazo, and it means literally to punch under the eye. It means to punch in the eye, to mean black and blue in our eye. That's the image. So Paul says, man, I beat my body. I am training hard. If you're training for a marathon, what happens? I know some of you, we have people that ran the JFK 50 last Sunday. When you're training for that, you sometimes get bone spurs and you get shin splints and you get ankles that are sore. You train up to that point. That's the image here. I don't want no one leave here and go, I'm going to go punch myself in the eye, spiritually speaking. No, he's using an analogy here. He says, I am beating my body. I am willing to go through the pain in order to go after the prize. I am exercising. I am training. I am ready. I'm all in. By the way, isn't that true of any Olympic athlete? I mean, the average Olympic long-distance runner trains 10 to 20 miles a day. The swimmers swim 10 miles a day just to be competitive, just to even make it. A gymnast works out 8 to 9 hours per day to be an Olympian. There's training. There's a training. There's beating bodies. There's getting ready. They're all in. They're committed. There is a price to running the race. What Paul is telling us here, what's going to stop you? Is what's stopping us other people? Is what's stopping us culture? Paul says, no. What can stop me from running this race? What can stop me from running this race to the end is the prize. The price. It costs too much and we give up. That leads to the prize. Let's look at the prize of this race. Now, if you were to study this passage out, you would probably say, well, the prize clearly is a crown. He says that there are some, they ran in that day for a perishable wreath, but we for an imperishable wreath. Now, there are a lot of scholars who write about this, and they say what we're running for, the prize, is one day we're going to have a crown in heaven that's going to be given to us. I actually disagree. Now, please, that doesn't mean go burn their books if you've read that. I'm going to tell you why I disagree. I'm going to try to give you proof as to why I think it's something different. I think the prize here is much different. I'm going to give you a reason why. But there are many that say this is an actual crown that we get in heaven. I think we tend to romanticize the crowns we get in heaven. Not that there aren't going to be any crowns in heaven. To be honest, whether I get a crown or not doesn't matter to me. The fact that I'm there is pretty awesome. And it says that any crown I get is going to go back at the feet of Jesus anyway. I didn't deserve it. I didn't earn it. I didn't do it. He did it. But the price here, I believe Paul gives us. Let's go back to verse 19. Back to verse 19. He says this, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jews I become as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I become as under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I become as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I become weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might win some." Same word there. Some say save some. "I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings." There are two words that are repeated 5 times. Anybody see what it is? 2 words that are repeated 5 times. Become and win. Paul says here is the prize that we're running after. I become all things to all people. Now, this does not mean we compromise our morality. This does not mean we have to go in and do what the Romans do. That's not his point here. His point is from a spiritual standpoint, I speak their language. I understand their culture. I'm able to present the gospel in that way. And here's his point. I become whatever it is I need to become. I let go, and this is all about rights. I let go of my rights in whatever way I need to so that I might win people. The prize of this race is none other than the presentation of the gospel to the lost. He says here, what I want to win is people. Now, please know, you and I realize that we can't save anyone. God saves. God changes lives. But our calling is to present the truth of Jesus Christ, that he died for us, he rose again for us, that he is coming again for us. That's the gospel message, by the way. That he did that, he offers salvation through his blood in his name. And our job is to share it. The prize we get is the opportunities we take to share the gospel. He says, I do this for the sake of the gospel. And we come to the end, and he says, listen, we run for an imperishable crown of souls, of people that we can impact. And he ends by saying, lest after I preach to others, verse 27, I myself should be disqualified. His point is not that he is going to be disqualified, that people aren't going to come to Jesus. His point is that he hasn't kept the race of sharing the gospel. That's what he's trying to win, is people. And he's saying, I don't want to be disqualified because I didn't share it. I didn't win because I didn't promote Jesus Christ and pronounce Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the life. This whole theme of this passage is all about setting aside my rights, Jew, Gentile, whatever it is, I become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. So they might be one, they might be known, they might be saved. See, Paul understood that lost people are losing eternally. That there needs to be the gospel presented. As one author said, there is a irreproducible minimum. What that is, an irreproducible minimum, is the idea that there is a basic thing that we see that every person needs. Irreproducible minimum is that smallest thing that we believe every person on earth needs. What is it? Is it air? Is that what every person on earth needs? Irreproducible minimum, is it air? If it's air, then when you see somebody choking or you see somebody without air, what are you doing? You're helping them. You're giving them all the air you can. Is it water? Is it clean drinking water? If that's the case, then every place we want to have clean drinking water. We want to build wells. That's a good thing. Is it food? Then that means if there's anybody hungry, we ought to give them food. Is it education? Then we ought to give education. We ought to try to find a way to make sure people get educated. What is the irreproducible minimum? What is the smallest thing that each person, every person, absolutely needs? I don't know about you. I've been to other countries like Nicaragua and Papua New Guinea, and I see some people that don't have much to eat. Some of them that don't have clean air. But even here, where I have somewhat clean air, and I still filter my water even though it's already filtered through the tap, I still filter the water, and I drink bottled water because that's now better. And now they're saying bottled water is not the best for you, so I'm going back to tap water. And food, right? I have abundance of food. I can eat and choose what I'm going to eat for lunch today. You know, in the end, I'm no different, though, because that's what's going to happen. I'm going to die. I am going to die just like the poorest person in the world. Because the irreproducible minimum is not air, food, or water. The irreproducible minimum is the gospel. It's Jesus. It is I see in the life of every person on earth that what they need more than anything else is Jesus Christ. Now, here's what happens for you and I. There's also not only an irreproducible minimum, there is an irrefutable argument. What I mean by that is that every one of us who knows Jesus is able to share that truth, that we know the answer to their need. We know the problem that they have. We have the answer for them. Now, you might be here this morning, you might say, listen, Dave, I'm not all that educated on these things. There are ways to be educated. I think of great ministries that we have here, like Truth Bomb Apologetics, and Chad Gross does a fantastic job of training people on how to understand what we believe and be able to defend the faith. But listen, folks, if you're here this morning, and there is never an excuse to say that because there's always information available, but even if you're here this morning and you know Jesus, and you would say, man, I just don't know a lot, you still have an irrefutable argument because you've been changed by Jesus. If you have been changed by Christ, then you're able to share something that cannot be refuted. How does anybody refute that argument? How do they say, well, you weren't changed by Jesus? What do you mean? How can they tell you you're not changed by Jesus? Especially in our pluralistic society where whatever you believe is good for you and whatever I believe is good for me. So they're not going to argue with you. And here's what happens, folks. When the irreproducible minimum meets the irrefutable argument, you have the gospel. You have the fulfillment of 1 Corinthians 9. You have the prize. When we see someone's greatest need and we challenge it with the greatest argument, guess what? You have the gospel right in there. You have Jesus Christ presented, the death, burial, and resurrection. Now, I want to leave us with something. What are we supposed to do now? We're all running in a race. Are you running to obtain? First of all, I would ask us to ask God to use us. Can we this morning say, God, give me an opportunity? Give me an opportunity to share the gospel. Now, some of us, we might be afraid to ask that because we know this is the heartbeat of God. He's going to give us an opportunity, but maybe we ought to ask, God, give me an opportunity to share the gospel. Not because God isn't going to give you an opportunity, but because you need to realize you want God to give you the opportunity. As someone once said, our best ability is our availability to God. He can take ordinary and make extraordinary out of it. So all I need to do is be available to him and make myself know that, God, I'm here for you. By the way, I know very well-trained, biblically literate people who are fearful of sharing the gospel. So you can have a lot of good head knowledge, but yet never share the gospel. And I know people that don't have a lot of head knowledge that are fervent about sharing what Jesus did for them. So head knowledge isn't what this is about. Is there answers? Yeah. Are there answers? Yes. But are you willing to say, God, give me an opportunity? Secondly, cultivate divine opportunities. What do I mean by that? I believe God gives us opportunities every single place that we go, everywhere we're at. He's called to, the question isn't, does he give the opportunities? There are divine opportunities. The question is, are we going to cultivate them? Are we going to build in them? Are we going to just kind of begin to till the ground where God has planted us to have it? And by the way, I have found in my own life that sometimes the most difficult people are the ones he wants me to cultivate the most. And he brings them into life. It could be at a workplace. It could be in a neighborhood. It could be in a store. It could be somebody we run into continually. And God is saying, I want you to cultivate that relationship because I have a purpose in it. I have a purpose in it. Thirdly, have strategic and wise relationships with unbelievers. Colossians says it this way, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of every opportunity. That we actually begin to look at every relationship from a strategic standpoint when it comes to the gospel instead of a personal standpoint. Isn't that what we ask in every relationship is, what can I get out of them? And I mean, we're human. I do the same thing. What can I get? How is this benefiting me? What good is this for me? instead of saying, God, how is this a great strategy for you? How can this be used for your glory and your gospel to be known? Someone once said, every 24 hours, 150,000 people die. They said this, if we're going to have a passion for the unsaved, we have to personalize them to the point in which their lostness brings more than a tear to our eye. That's powerful. It's not just a tear to our eye to know that people die. It's that we have to do something. We have to move. We have to act. We have to not just give our best afterthought. We have to give our best attention to what God wants to do.